For the majority of people, there is just one reason why Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger make headlines: food shortages, insecurity, sanctions, coups, and crises. These nations are rarely mentioned in narratives concerning long-term planning or economic strategy. For this reason, a decision made in secret in the capital of Mali merits consideration. The military-run administrations of these three Sahelian republics decided in December 2025 to establish a joint regional investment bank, a financial organization intended to finance agricultural, power projects, and roads throughout their respective regions. The bank will be financed by the nations themselves, not by foreign donors, and has a capital of 500 billion CFA francs, or roughly $895 million. To make it function, each has contributed a share of its own tax income. It sounds uninteresting and technical at first. However, this choice reflects a more profound change in these nations' plans to finance development, lessen their reliance on outside assistance, and take charge of their economic destiny. What alterations will this result in then? Let's investigate. For many years, the descriptions of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were nearly the same: vulnerable, reliant on assistance, and always unsteady. Every time the topic of development was brought up, it was framed as something that would come from outside, like a grant subject to conditions, a loan approved in a foreign capital, or a project created elsewhere and carried out locally. Up until December 2025, few individuals questioned the trend because it had become so commonplace. The three nations made a decision in Bamako that month that deviated significantly from that plan. They decided to establish their own regional investment bank without waiting for donors or disclosing talks with foreign financiers. The institution was established with a capital of 500 billion CFA francs, or about $895 million USD, specifically for the aim of funding agricultural, energy, and infrastructure projects inside its boundaries. A working bank with committed capital, no symbolism, no ambiguous promises. The context, in addition to the timing, was what set the move apart. The military is in charge of all three governments. Insurgent organizations pose a threat to the security of all three. Different levels of economic and diplomatic pressure are applied on all three. Most states reduce long-term spending and concentrate on survival in that situation. These three took the opposite action. They secured funding for development. The choice was not the result of abundance. It came out of limitation. Conventional regional mechanisms were no longer accessible. ECOWAS relations had fallen apart. Donor confidence was strained. External funding was now politically unpredictable, conditional, and sluggish. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger opted to avoid certain channels rather than try to fix them first. The bank they established does not accept aid. It is a lender for development. That distinction is important. Aid is only used once. Money revolves around a bank. It makes loans, collects payments, and reinvests money. It expands with time. By selecting a banking model, the three states made it clear that the goal was to create a long-term funding mechanism rather than provide emergency aid. The industries that were targeted were also instructive. Market access and connection are determined by infrastructure. Industry's ability to exist at all depends on energy. Food prices, imports, and political stability are all influenced by agriculture. These are not quick victories. They are the costly and slow pillars of sovereignty. Due to the lengthy and politically delicate returns, projects in these fields frequently have difficulty obtaining donor support. This bank was created especially to finance things that others would not. The bank's funding source is equally crucial. To capitalize the institution, each nation contributed about 5% of its tax income. This indicates that the funds originate from domestic economic activity. It's not borrowed. It is not contingent. At the request of an outside partner, it cannot be reversed. Capital builds up once tax revenue is received. The development equation is radically altered by this decision. Accountability turns inward when domestic taxes are used to finance projects. The state is responsible for delays, mistakes, and achievements. There is neither an external authority to submit to nor a giver to blame. Development becomes into a governance issue rather than a negotiation issue. Expectations have already changed just by virtue of the bank's existence at this early stage. It demonstrates that these nations are deliberately reorganizing how they want to fund their future, rather than just responding to pressure. The action compels a reevaluation of the Sahel's true level of agency when it chooses to take collective action. And that brings up the main query that arises from this initial action. Instead of acting independently, why did these three nations decide to pool their resources and take this risk together? Since none of them could afford to act alone, they decided to band together. Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali all have the same structural issue on their own: overwhelming demands and limited financial resources. Roads must be constructed over large areas. Power production is still inadequate. The majority of people work in agriculture, yet it is still undercapitalized. A national budget can be depleted by any one of these issues. Together, the three of them can break it. The maths is altered when resources are pooled. Instead of dispersing capital, a regional investment bank enables it to be concentrated. A single institution can prioritize initiatives based on regional impact, economic return, and strategic importance rather than three tiny national programs vying for limited funding. It disperses risk as well. The institution as a whole continues to operate even if one nation experiences a brief fiscal shock. However, cooperation was important at this time for a deeper purpose. These three nations no longer function within the same geographic framework. Their decision to leave ECOWAS was not symbolic. They were cut off from the forums for policy coordination, development initiatives, and funding that had molded West Africa for decades. Leaving the bloc left a financial and political void. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger decided to fill the void instead of leaving it unfilled. A portion of the economic infrastructure that ECOWAS formerly supplied is essentially replaced by the bank. Rather than depending on regional development organizations, whose decision-making authority was distributed and subject to political restrictions, they established one where they maintain complete control. Shared ownership eliminates donor-driven policy frameworks, external voting blocks, and shared governance. Collaborating also conveys an internal message rather than an external one. The three governments themselves are less unsure when they work together. Coordination is forced and policy divergence is discouraged by shared capital. Political fragmentation becomes costly once financial systems are connected. In this way, the bank serves as a political and financial stabilizer. Additionally, the institution's credibility is increased by the regional strategy. In the Sahel, a single-country development bank can be written off as transient or vulnerable. A multinational bank supported by combined tax revenues and economies wealthy in minerals has greater clout. It is a sign of permanence. It implies that there is no way to discreetly stop this trial. For the following stage, this credibility is important. It is not intended for the bank to end at $895 million. The foundation, not the ceiling, is that initial capital. By functioning as a regional lender, the organization is able to raise more money from aligned governments, regional partners, and African financial markets without giving up control over project selection. Crucially, the collaboration is based on common economic reasoning rather than ideology. The three nations rely on comparable industries. Each of the three has comparable limitations. The constraints of donor-led development have been experienced by all three. It is not symbolic to act in unison. Efficiency is the key. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are trying to establish economies of scale where none previously existed by combining funds, risk, and planning capabilities. That alone has the power to decide whether significant energy and infrastructural projects become reality. However, Capital and collaboration alone are insufficient. Any development bank's ability to succeed ultimately hinges on its governance, including who manages it, how decisions are made, and whether or not financial discipline is upheld. Therefore, it is now impossible to avoid asking how this bank will be run and what safeguards are in place to keep it from turning into another weak organization. These governments are attempting to draw the line that it will be run like a bank rather than a political office. Officials made it apparent from away that this organization is not intended to function like a spending agency or a ministry. The bank is now functioning, according to Mali's finance minister, and the next stage is to choose executives who would oversee fund mobilization, project approval, and repayment enforcement. That order is important. Prioritize capital, structure, and leadership. Many state-led development initiatives fall short in this area. Although funds are available and intentions are declared, governance is hurried or politicized. It seems that these governments are aware of the risk. They demonstrated that this is a functional lender that must adhere to financial norms rather than a placeholder institution by postponing leadership nominations until after capital commitments were obtained. Whether the bank is permitted to act like a bank will be the main test. This entails assessing initiatives based on their economic feasibility rather than their political connotation. It entails requiring repayment even in cases where borrowers have ties to the state. It entails turning down initiatives that aren't long-term viable. In settings where political pressure is ongoing, none of this is simple. However, the bank's organizational structure encourages discipline. Mismanagement has immediate domestic repercussions because the capital is derived from tax revenues, and losses are not covered by external creditors or foreign donors. They directly affect national budgets. For decision-makers, that alone increases the cost of failure. Another level of accountability is added by the institution's regional focus. Capital from all three nations supports a project that has been approved in one. Peer pressure results from that. No administration wants to justify to its neighbors why public dollars were squandered on ill-conceived projects. Mismanagement is exposed by regional ownership. Expertise is another issue. Patriotism is not the only factor that makes development banks successful. Technical expertise, risk assessment, project finance, and sectoral knowledge are all necessary. For this reason, the selection of leadership is seen as a critical stage. The ability of the bank's management to function within financial realities will have a greater impact on the bank's credibility than political alignment. History provides helpful background. Stable conditions were rarely the birthplace of successful development banks. Following the war, state-run finance formed in South Korea. In the midst of political unpredictability, Europe's rehabilitation banks were established. Even China's policy banks had to deal with a great deal of external mistrust. Discipline was what set them apart, not the lack of politics. The establishment of this bank is scrutinized. Critics will highlight the risks to government, penalties, and instability. Long-term planning and necessity will be cited by supporters. Both are right. The organization is situated at the nexus between vulnerability and ambition. However, there is a structural advantage that wasn't present in previous decades. These three nations are in charge of resources that produce consistent income. Uranium in Niger, gold in Burkina Faso and Mali. If properly handled, those income generate possible capital inflows that could fortify the bank. This institution can be strengthened by domestic riches, in contrast to those that rely on help. Announcements or early disbursements will not be used to gauge the bank's success. Repayment rates, project completion, and capital growth over time will be used to gauge it. That is a more illuminating story, but it moves more slowly, and this returns the emphasis to intent. The purpose of a development bank is not to impress onlookers. It is designed to change who determines what is constructed. This raises the more profound question of how this bank genuinely alters the power dynamics between these governments and the outside parties on which they previously relied. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. It modifies leverage in subtle, structural, and difficult-to-reverse ways. One straightforward truth drove the power dynamics between Sahel governments and outside actors for decades. Finance for development came from outside sources, including donors, regional blocs, and international organizations. As a result, those actors gained narrative, timing, and veto power. Funds may be frozen, constraints may be added or removed, and projects may be postponed. Even when aid did come, it was frequently diminished, altered, or delivered late. Funded by domestic taxes, a regional investment bank fundamentally upends that structure. Leverage decreases after capital is internalized. Since the financial source is not international, no foreign capital can be halted in the middle of the project. Since project approval takes place within the organization, a donor committee cannot covertly reorder any policy priority. Development becomes something that is carried out rather than something that is argued. This does not imply the disappearance of foreign actors. It implies a shift in their role. They become optional partners rather than gatekeepers. If invited, they become co-financers rather than decision-makers. The timing of this change is important. This bank is not being constructed in a neutral geopolitical moment by Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger. They are acting in response to growing pressure to realign politically, their withdrawal from ECOWAS, and disagreements with long-standing allies. Financial independence is protective in that situation rather than abstract. These states lessen their vulnerability to political conditionality by establishing its own lender. Financial retaliation is less likely to affect security policy, diplomatic alignment, and domestic changes. This blunts the pressure's sharpest edge, but does not remove it. A psychological component is also present. Domestic planning frequently becomes reactive when development is sponsored by outside sources. Governments await budget support assessments, donor missions, and approval cycles. As initiative shifts outward, internal capacity gradually deteriorates. That flow is reversed by this bank. Local planning is the first step. Projects are created to accommodate domestic priorities and schedules. The state becomes an allocator instead of an applicant. Just that change modifies the way ministries plan, coordinate, and think. Additionally, the bank unifies the three states' political orientation on a regional level. Shared exposure is produced by shared capital. The institution acts as a buffer when one government is under duress. One nation's economic advances can sustain the entire system if it stabilizes more quickly. Their collective bargaining stance is strengthened by this connection. The message is apparent but subtle from the outside. These nations do not oppose collaboration. Dependency is being rejected by them. Doors are not being closed by them. The people in charge are shifting. This change does not, of course, ensure success. Just like outside assistance, capital control can be abused. However, the cause of failure shifts. Internal accountability is in place if projects fail presently. Even while it is uncomfortable, that accountability is a kind of power in and of itself. Additionally, the bank sends out a signal to domestic populations. Development is no longer presented as a gift that outsiders have postponed. It is presented as a national endeavor supported by national funds. Over time, that may change political legitimacy and public expectations. To put it briefly, the global financial system is not overthrown by this organization. When it can, it avoids it, and when it must, it bargains with it. That is a much more resilient approach. However, autonomy and leverage present a new difficulty that cannot be delegated or ignored. Therefore, once these governments have complete control over the funds intended to build their future, the crucial question is whether they can maintain discipline and constraint. The moment the first significant decisions are taken, that discipline will be put to the test. Pressure comes from all sides once a development bank starts approving loans. Political friends want speed, local authorities want visibility, and ministries want flagship projects. The desire to move quickly, demonstrate success early, and present outcomes before mechanisms are completely established is always there in unstable contexts. That's where a lot of institutions discreetly fail. Almost immediately, this bank will be put to the test. Agriculture, energy, and infrastructure are not neutral industries. Which areas are developed and which are avoided are determined by roads. Which industry survive depends on power developments. Food prices, imports, and political stability are all impacted by agricultural funding. Every choice has winners and losers. For this reason, discipline is more important than ambition. Capital will swiftly evaporate if the bank authorizes projects based more on political urgency than on economic viability. The revolving paradigm fails if repayment is not enforced because borrowers are politically sensitive or connected to the state. The bank ceases to be a bank and becomes a spending agency when repayment becomes sluggish, and spending agencies are short-lived without outside assistance. The regional structure becomes a two-edged sword at this point. Peer pressure is a result of shared ownership. However, it amplifies political interests surrounding every choice. Every government will want its priorities to be represented. It will take moderation, which is uncommon in times of crisis, to balance those needs without dividing capital. Theoretically, skilled management is the safeguard. It is not optional for executives to have knowledge of project finance, risk assessment, and long-term capital preservation. They're existential. For this reason, rather than being a formality, the leadership appointments are viewed as a critical stage. These decisions will either strengthen or weaken the bank's credibility. Sequencing is another problem. A bank that practices discipline doesn't fund everything at once. It begins modestly, demonstrates cycles of payback, and grows with time. It is difficult to politically justify that forbearance, particularly when demands are excessive. However, capital burns quickly without it. Perception is another danger. Outside observers will keep a watchful eye out for any indications of poor administration, so they can discount the trial as a whole. Internal populations will anticipate rapid advancements. The bank is caught between expectations and skepticism, both of which are harsh. However, there is another benefit that was absent from previous initiatives to build self-finance. These governments are not acting as though they are impervious to defeat. They are clearly constrained in their behavior. That compels realism. When capital is limited and pressure is continuous, there is little space for illusion. Restraint is inevitable because the bank is funded by domestic tax revenue. National budgets are immediately impacted by any error. Every loss is experienced on an interior level. This generates incentives that donor-funded initiatives did not. In the end, dull fundamentals will be more important to the bank's survival than ideology. Balance sheets, project schedules, repayment rates, and enforcement. These are the stories that determine whether institutions survive, but they are not particularly thrilling. And with that, everything reaches its ultimate turning point. The ramifications go well beyond Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger if discipline is maintained, capital flows, and projects are successful. What would happen if this bank demonstrated that nations under duress could finance themselves without waiting for authorization? That is the concern that looms over the entire endeavor. If it succeeds, the impact will be beyond that of any one farm, road, or dam. The immediate result would be useful. Without waiting for donor cycles, projects are constructed. Infrastructure facilitates quicker market connections. Agriculture becomes a source of stability rather than vulnerability as energy capacity increases with fewer political barriers. However, the more profound effects would be structural and psychological. It would demonstrate that outside consent is not necessary for development to start in the Sahel. For outdated systems based on leverage, that is a risky concept. because the reasoning spreads gradually, rather than instantly once one region shows that institutional discipline, regional cooperation, and indigenous capital can replace reliance on aid. Under pressure, other states would take notes, not because they have similar ideologies, but rather because they have similar limitations. Restricted financial access, restrictive lending, and outside influence over internal priorities. To be disruptive, the model wouldn't have to be exactly replicated. The notion that aid is the only option is undermined by even partial imitation. Success would also change internal dynamics in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Governments would be evaluated more on the completion of projects than on their promises. Instead of negotiating for exclusions, ministries would have to prepare within budgetary constraints. The public's expectations would change from anticipating miracles supported by foreign sources to calling for home outcomes. That type of governance is more difficult. However, it is also a more truthful one. Beyond security coordination, regional cooperation would be anchored by an operational investment bank. Shared futures are produced by shared finance. Political alignment is sustained by economic connection. When capital is linked, even differences turn into negotiations rather than fissures. Outside, the dialogue shifts. Instead of making demands, partners make offers. Investment is no longer a directive, but rather a conversation. Sovereignty becomes operational rather than symbolic. Naturally, failure would also have repercussions. A bank failure would harden narratives about incapacity, justify external control, and increase skepticism. Everyone concerned is aware that there is a real risk. However, the choice to give it a shot already indicates something significant. These countries are no longer shaping their futures around what has been withheld from them. Instead, they are organizing their path forward based on what remains firmly within their control. Stronger institutions, fair taxation, natural resources, and strategic cooperation. No matter how events unfold, this shift is profoundly meaningful. External aid can never teach the same lessons as building imperfect institutions with domestic capital. When systems are built from within, weaknesses surface early, allowing them to be addressed rather than hidden. This process demands discipline. It forces clarity in priorities. Most importantly, it redirects responsibility inward, where real accountability belongs. In the end, this initiative is not about rejecting the world. It is about re-entering it on new, self-defined terms. For that reason, the most important outcome may not even be financial. As development in the Sahel becomes a choice made at home, rather than a request submitted abroad, one unavoidable question remains: who truly controls the future once nations realize they can fund their own progress? Tell us what you think in the comments section below, and please subscribe for more informative videos like this one.